Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio, and I'm your host, Carter Seaton. Today, we are so happy to have our distinguished author, Jeff Mann, with us, and we welcome you to Chapters. Thank you so much.
Glad to be here.
He is a multi-talented, multi-genre, award-winning, and highly prolific author. It's just a real delight to have you here. Jeff grew up in Kentucky, in Covington, Virginia, and Hinton, West Virginia. He received degrees in English and forestry from West Virginia University. His poetry, fiction, and essays have appeared in many publications, including Arts and Letters, Prairie Schooner, Shenandoah, Willow Springs, the Gay and Lesbian Review Worldwide, Crab Orchard Review, and Appalachian Heritage. He's published 3 award-winning poetry chapbooks, 5 full-length books of poetry, 2 collections of personal essays, 3 novellas, 5 novels, a book of poetry and memoir, and 3 volumes of short fiction. And that's just up until today, because you have another book that's out now. In 2013, he was inducted into the Saints and Sinners Literary Festival Hall of Fame. He teaches creative writing at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. Quite a collection of work.
I keep busy.
Yes, you do. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
When did you start writing?
7th grade.
Oh, my word.
My father brought me up to love reading and the outdoors. And he used to talk to me about how in the spring he could imagine underneath asphalt crocuses growing and bumping their heads up against, which was a disturbing image, you know. He was very much about nature and not technology, not cities. And so I wrote my first poem called Crocuses.
Wow.
And borrowed that whole conceit from him.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
That's amazing. All right, let's talk a little bit about the various ways you express yourself through the written word. Many authors just stick with one format. You don't. You've been all over the map with poetry, with short fiction, novels, novellas, memoir. Do you have a favorite?
Well, I started with poetry, and I come back to poetry. I hadn't written poems for years, last couple of years, because I've been busy focusing on other things. But this summer, I started a new book of poems about the Norse runes. So I'm writing, there are 24 runes in something called the Elder Futhark. There are several different alphabets, and I'm writing 3 poems for every of the 24 runes. So I'm about a third done. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to start writing this series of novels about Vikings.
All right, now that brings me to an interesting point. Do you find that one genre allows you to express yourself in a certain way, and that's what causes you to choose that particular?
I think so. I think poetry for me is about emotion and visuals, it's little snapshots almost. Essays are about trying to think something out, make sense of things, and novels for me are about both setting and about characters, and obviously about narrative, telling a story.
Sure.
So the only thing I don't do is playwriting, but I guess dialogue in novels is close. So,
right, exactly. What does each provide for you in that way of telling about yourself or about expressing what you feel? What does that give you to change from one to the other?
Well, writing poetry is making sense of my own inner life and its relationship to the rest of the world. Essays, well, I should say that poetry is, for me, is more of an emotional way of trying to figure out those connections. Essays are more of an intellectual way of figuring out those connections between my interiority, is that a word? Yeah, I think, and the world. Writing fiction is sort of a way to get out of me, and become somebody else. There's very large parts of me in most of my protagonists. So that's how that works.
I think a lot of authors do write just to, well, Pat Conway used to say that he wrote to figure out himself and the demons, that he had inside him or what had bothered him all his life. And lots of people say that. So I think that's probably not an uncommon way for you to look at it, is to express your interiority, which is a great word, in a variety of ways. Do you find one more freeing than another?
Probably fiction, just because, again, it's a way to kind of get out of myself and where I am and where the time in which I live. And so, yeah. All
right, so now you've taken on the role of editor. Is this the first time you've done that?
First time, yep.
And how was that compared to doing your own writing?
Well, I mean, it couldn't have been a more positive experience because of my co-editor. I've heard stories of people who co-edit and they never speak to one another again. And Julia and I just got to be friends. And her sense of humor got me through. There's always going to be some rocky moments, right? And her sense of humor really helped me deal with some of the more difficult moments. And then I started to read her work, so now I've become a big fan of her fiction.
You did not know her before you all started on this project together?
We'd met.
You'd met.
But I hadn't read any of her work except maybe a short piece here and there. Now I've read, I don't know how many of her novels. Of course, she's prolific. I've read maybe 5, but I got 2 more on my bookshelves waiting to get to once I have other projects done. So, that said, I don't know that I'd edit again just because I'm selfish and it takes time away from my own work. And with this process, there's just when you think you got everything set, something else happens, and it kind of shatters your focus, your own creative focus, because you're not really being creative in putting together an anthology so much as you're organizing. It's a different thing.
Right.
So this is probably the only anthology I would have been willing to edit, just because it deals with the whole LGBT and Appalachia in one book, which is what so much of my work does. A book like this had never existed before. Now, thanks to WVU Press and Julia and me, it does exist. I don't think I'd do it again. But. All
right, so the book is the LGBTQ Fiction and Poetry from Appalachia. And did WVU, they published it, did they approach you all about pulling this together?
They did.
Okay.
They were great to work with. That press is putting out all kinds of really good books. It was April 2017. I gave a reading of it at WVU. And Abby Freeland, who worked for the press, she's one of the editors, asked me if we could have lunch the next day, that she had a proposition. So we had lunch, and she said, and I said, well, I'll think about it. So I thought about it for 24 hours, and then I said, yep. And then I invited Julia to be my co-editor, because again, we'd met, we have some mutual friends in common. So that's how that happened.
I see.
And then it took, these university presses, it takes a while.
Yeah.
And that was April 2017. The book came out in April 2019.
That's about typical.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
it really
typical.
is. Yeah.
All right. So, how did you make the selections as to who would be in the book?
Right.
Things like demographics of the contributors, their age, their ethnicity.
Sure.
Things like that. Tell me about that.
Well, the press gave us some pretty strong opinions on that from the get-go, which was fine.
Okay.
Because I'd never edited. Now, Julia had edited. That's one of the reasons I asked her to be co-editor, because she had that experience and I didn't, and that came in handy. I knew it would. The press suggested, one, that it not be an open call, that we invite people, and we invite people who had published quite a bit, preferably at least one book. And then between Abby Freeland at WVU Press and her asking various other folks, and Julia and I thinking about the people that we knew, and then outside reviewers suggesting some folks, that's how it all came together.
Is that what you meant by you think you get it all together and then something happens?
Well, especially with the university press books, because they have that outside review thing.
Right.
And but I mean, that was not painful. You're always worried.
Yeah.
You're waiting for the outside reviewer. But one just gave a very positive review, and the other one had a couple suggestions of people to add, and that was fine with me. I thought, okay, sure.
Sure, right.
So
tell viewers what an open call would have been?
Well, an open call would have been advertising in literary magazines and saying, we're looking for people for this anthology, and if you're interested in being part of the book, please submit work.
And then you all would have had to call from that list, which would have made it much more time-consuming process. Yeah.
Yes, as it was, we knew the quality of these people for the most part, and we took just about everything they sent us. I think that with the poems, we decided only to take a certain number of poems. So
From each author?
There were a few poets where we took a certain number, and then there were a couple maybe that we didn't take. But it was all such good material that it was.
So are there any essays in it, or is it just fiction and poetry?
It's just fiction and poetry, and that again was because I asked WVU Press, "Well, what about creative nonfiction?" And they said, "Not at this point. Maybe in the future."
I see. So that could be another book.
Yeah. I've thought about that. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah.
I might be. That's the only thing that well, at any rate, yeah.
All right. So are all of these contributors Appalachian?
They are.
Okay.
In one way, they might not live here any longer, but they certainly have roots in the region.
Okay.
Yeah.
And men and women, there's a.
That's about. I think it's exactly split.
Is it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Which is, I thought. I mean, that just sort of happened. But I was very pleased that
And
it was
the
an
age
exact
goes
split.
from what to what?
Oh my! Well, Dorothy Allison and I correspond. I just turned 60, and she just turned 70. And Jonathan Corcoran is probably in his 20s. So
Right.
there you go.
Yeah. And Charles Lloyd is in his 70s. So, yeah, that's wonderful. It's a great anthology. There's some wonderful pieces in it. I just enjoyed them so much. And you have mostly poetry in it.
I do.
But one piece of short fiction. And I think of the poems, my favorite was Yellow Eye Beans. Would you read that for us?
Yeah, a lot
I just
of people
love
like
that book.
poem. It'll make me hungry, though.
Well,
Thank you.
you can survive.
That's all right. Okay, yellow eye beans. I sort them as I was taught. Is this the way the Norns allot destinies? Picking out gravel, bits of dirt, the shriveled, discolored ones not fit to eat, faded for the trash. Sort, rinse, soak overnight, season with onion, hog jowl, bacon grease. Some more objective observer might see in my kitchen gestures, sorting these yellow eye beans, or stringing half-runners, or rolling out pie crust or biscuits. My father's, and behind those, his mother's, yours. Hill folk head for beans and cornbread when the world turns surly. Pinto, yellow eye, October. These were your favorite. Simmering them, I remember you. Nanny, what would you think of me now, 20 years after your death? With my bushy grizzly bear beard, my myriad tattoos, my lust for chest hair, the man I live with. My guess would be, after a short lecture on the Bible, a book I never much cared about to begin with, you'd settle down to table with us, admiring how handsome this home is John's made for me. I've learned a lot in 20 years, and at last it would be my turn to cook for you. I promise you'd be proud of how well the beans and cornbread came out, and if you like this meal, you ought to taste my buttermilk biscuits. But before we ate, I'd invite you to say what grace you wanted in this queer and pagan home, and so you would, words brief and deep, past the chow-chow, following closely on amen.
That's beautiful. That really is beautiful. That's your grandmother lived in Hinton?
She lived in a little community outside of Hinton where my sister lives now, Forest Hill. She was my father's mother. She was a feral, so I get the Irish blood from her.
Well, it's beautiful, as are the other poems in there.
Thank you.
So you have a new book out.
I do.
Tell me about that.
It is my first collection of personal essays, creative nonfiction, since 2010 or 11. So it's collected all those essays that I published in anthologies and magazines since that last book, plus I can't remember, 4, 5, 6 new pieces that I wrote last fall. I was on research lead from Virginia Tech at half pay. So I wrote some of the longest essays I've ever written. Really. Yeah.
And do they have a collective theme? And what is the title of the essay?
It's called there's an essay in it called A Surly Bear in the Bible Belt, which would be me.
I like that.
And my publisher suggested endangered species, a surly bear in the Bible Belt. So it's a chunky book. I just got copies the day before yesterday. Well, there's a lot of essays, again, about balancing Appalachian gay identity. There's some pieces that speak to the present political climate. There's an essay called Muslim Food, which is about Iraqi and Iranian people I've known and my enthusiasm for their cuisine and how cuisine can create kind of cross-cultural understanding. There's an essay about my friend from Huntington, Okie Napier, called A Ferocious Drag Queen, which was fun to write and painful to write.
Sure.
There's an essay about buying a gun when Trump was elected, which is something I never thought I would ever want to do. It's not here, but it's in my truck. It goes all over the place, really. But and then of course, A Surly Bear in the Bible Belt, the essay itself, is about me growing up in a very conservative religious area and realizing that I was gay and responding to that kind of Christianity with fear and loathing, and becoming a pagan and sort of as a response to that, and how difficult it is to continue. That's the one element of Appalachian culture that I don't have anything to do with and that frightens me.
I think that's one of the reasons that this book is also so important, because many of these have to do with dealing with the identities of gay and lesbian people in Appalachia, and I recognize the difficulty that is, and it always creates a tension.
It does.
One way or the other, and how all of these authors have dealt with it is what makes that book so important, I think.
And I got off easy because my parents didn't raise me in any particular religious path, but all around us there were Southern Baptists who were very intolerant.
Right.
So, I mean, I can't imagine I would ever become a pagan, except that my parents gave me that option. And my movement towards neo-paganism was in direct response to my fear of fundamentalist Christianity and its attitudes towards any number of things. But I've known a lot of gay and lesbian people who grew up in families of conservative Christianity.
Without acceptance.
So hard, like 100 times harder for them than me.
Sure. Right. Yeah. All right, let's talk a little bit about something entirely different. You teach creative writing at Virginia Tech. How important do you think it is for aspiring writers to actually take classes in writing and or to get an MFA? Do you think people can be a good writer without those things?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
But
then if that's the case, then what does it bring to them if they do it?
You get time to write. And if you've got a full-time job, especially a job that doesn't have anything to do with writing, mine does, so I can continue to write. But I worked as a naturalist at Pipestem State Park when in my early 20s. And after it wasn't 9 to 5, but the variable schedule, but I'd come home and have a few drinks, fall asleep on the couch. I wasn't going to write. So it gives them that time to focus on their own writing. Plus, they get to be around other writers, which is a luxury, really. I live in great isolation, really, from other writers. Part of that is chosen, part of it isn't. And they also learn sometimes how to network, which is something I never learned how to do. I'm very bad at it, and it's really handicapped my career. And they get all of those things. And if they're lucky, they might get a sense of the history of their genre. So, for instance, I have a grad poetry workshop now, and 2 of the students are poets and 2 of them are fiction writers. And the fiction writers have said, we don't really know a lot about poets writing today, the history of poetry. And I said, I can help you with that. So those are some of the advantages.
Yeah, I think having a community of writers is extremely important, and I'm sure that exists around some of the people that you have taught, probably, and they get that opportunity.
Very much so. Our MFA program is pretty small, and so it tends to be fairly cohesive, and there tends to be a sense of siblinghood, I guess you should say, right?
Yeah.
They socialize together, they help one another with one another's work, and it's a healthy thing to have.
Workshopping and things like that.
Yeah.
So if people were going to take a class of any kind, and say that, a lot of people go to conferences and they have workshops and so forth. If you're just beginning as a writer, what would you recommend they do to kind of jumpstart that process for themselves?
Well, as I kind of suggested before, read within that genre, because when I'm writing poems, I read books of poetry. When I'm writing essays, I read essays. It sort of primes the pump. And I'm really surprised at how many young writers will say, well, I don't really want to read that stuff. I just want to write my own. It's like, I don't understand that. The reason I'm a writer is because I was a voracious reader. And I ran across writers who sort of gave me permission to do what I do.
Yeah.
I think that workshops, not just ones connected with, not in the MFA program, but for instance, this summer, I taught at the West Virginia Writers Workshop at WVU Morgantown. And the reason I did was because last year here, last October, I met Renee Nicholson, who co-read with me, and she invited me up there. And when I taught that poetry workshop for 3 days, it was 95 degrees in Morgantown in July. It was horrible. We stayed inside, right, in the air conditioning. Almost everybody in that group of people knew one another because they go to, and they're all, I think, people who have jobs outside, most of them outside of academia. So this is one of the few places where they can focus on their poetry. They knew one another because they go to all these different workshops around the country together. So I just sort of sat back and let them go at it because it was this little community already. And they were from all over the place. It was a wonderful group. So I think that's one of the other things that people do is they just go to all these different. Of course, you need to have a certain amount of money to be able to do that.
Yes, you do, right. Well, I think having a writing community, and I think we have one here in the Huntington tri-state area, has been a huge asset to everybody that's a part of it.
Good.
There are various workshop groups, and I think it makes a big difference.
It does. Saints and Sinners for me has been the thing that's really, that's pretty much my community down in New Orleans.
Yeah, right. Is there, of all the things you've written, is there something that's your very, very favorite? Sort of feels like your child.
Well, I guess there's 2 books, really. One is sort of a YA novel called Cub, which is a rewrite of my alternative history of my senior year in high school. I like those characters very much. They're sweet boys. And then I have my last book of poetry is called Rebels, and it's about the Civil War. For the most part, the Confederate experience in the Civil War, because I'm the descendant of a Confederate soldier. And my publisher, I don't know why he did this, he's kind, because people don't buy poetry very much. But he paid all these artists to illustrate that book. So it's this gorgeous hardback with all these color drawings by all these different artists that illustrate various of the poems. It's probably just
beautiful.
In terms of my books, it's just the prettiest one, just to browse through. So I guess those would be the 2.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about Cub.
Well, I very deliberately put as many details of my home county in that book as I could.
Without calling it your home county?
Oh, no, I called
did?
it my home county. Oh, yeah. I said it, I think, in the early 90s, maybe.
Was this a rebellion thing you were doing?
No, it was an appreciative.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm past the rebellion.
Okay.
I'm fond of that place. So I kind of had this checklist of interesting places in Summers County, and I put them all in there. And I also put in all of the good home cooking that I grew up on. I managed a checklist of all this food.
Including yellow beans?
Beans of some kind, maybe pintos. I don't know if yellow eyes are in there or not. It's about a relationship between this young kind of nerdy, hairy boy, based on what I used to be, and this bisexual friend of his, and they get to be involved. And of course, then things get complicated, because if it didn't get complicated, there wouldn't be a novel.
Story. That's
Yeah,
right.
right.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they're sweet boys, and I enjoyed putting all those places in Summers County.
There's another poem in here, I think, of yours that must have been about your grandmother. Can't remember now which one it is, but I'll find it. Isn't there another one?
Well, there's one about coming back to Hinton and sort of making peace with it. There's some angry ones. One of them's about those crosses that Coffindauer put up.
Right. Is it Training the Enemy?
I mentioned, I think, something about my mother.
Yeah, right.
The sort of little gentleman my mother wanted me to be.
Yeah. I think they're all beautiful. They're just very evocative. Your way of writing is descriptive, emotional, and it's touching in a lot of ways.
Well,
I really enjoyed them.
That's what I want it to be.
Yeah, that's good.
If I'm going to be emotional writing it, I'm hoping people get emotional
Absolutely.
reading it.
I think that's the way it should be.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. Good. Thank you so much
You
for being
bet.
here. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
That'll do it for today.
Appreciate it.
And we want to thank the Inner Geek for providing us with a space to do these interviews. It's their on-site support and assistance, and thank you for Armstrong Television being willing to show these programs. We're delighted. You can come down to the Inner Geek and pick up copies of Jeff's books, and we hope that you will do that, as well as the other authors that we've had featured on chapters. Their books are here too. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Connect with Chapters via email. Write to lp4@zoom.email. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, and follow. All chapter episodes are available on YouTube. Visit Armstrong's YouTube channel, follow Armstrong, and look for a playlist of all the chapter's programs.